Welcome everyone. I am Tobias Smith. I am from the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Queensland, coming to you from my home garage/office. Now, I am going to share my screen with you, and we are going to get right into this. Let me make it full screen. Here we go. So, the science of stingless bees. Now, I'm sure many of you have already heard of stingless bees. Those of you who haven't, let me tell you that they're the most charismatic group of bees in the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about their biology. I'm going to talk a little bit about their diversity around the world. And then I'm going to move into a bit about stingless beekeeping because it's a big thing all around the world. And then I'm going to finish with a few of the things that we're doing in the way of science of stingless bees at UQ at the moment. But first, because the stingless bees are only one group of global bees, I want to put these bees in the context of global bee diversity. So we have over 20,000 different bee species on the planet. In fact, the last time I checked on the website that keeps a tally on all of the named species, so if someone describes a new species and gives it a name, this goes to this tally. Last week it was 20,473. And this number is constantly ticking up because people are constantly finding new bee species around the world. And based on that rate of new discovery, we think there's probably 25, maybe even 30,000 bee species on the planet. Now, the birds, there's about 12,000 bird species described around the world. So the bees are by far more diverse than the birds. And I don't think there's many new birds being discovered around the world anymore, but there are plenty of bees to go. And you can see from the ones on the screen here, just how diverse they are in their form as well, in their appearance, in their size, in their life cycles, all sorts of ways. Here in Australia, we have 1,660 named species. And again, those are just the ones that have been described. And again, this number keeps trickling up. So far this year, I think, in the last 12 months, there's been about 20 to 30 new bee species described in Australia. And based on that rate of discovery, we think that there's probably about 2,000, maybe 2,500 species here. So lots still awaiting discovery. Now, the thing about bees is most bees are not like what most people think bees are like. When people think of bees, they usually think of a colony of bees with a queen, with hexagons, with workers, with honey in this highly used social behavior. That, in fact, is very, very unusual in the bee world. Most bees are actually truly solitary bees. So truly solitary bees, a single female nests by herself, making the nest by herself, raising her babies by herself, gathering food, doing everything by herself. Now, that's like 75% of the world's bees. Then we've got about 20 or so percent which live lives of various forms of semi-sociality. So they do live in colonies, but very small colonies, no honey, nothing like what we think of as a big honey producing colony. Then lastly, we've got the highly used social bees. They're the ones I'm going to talk about today. They represent less than 5% of the world's bees, but these are the ones that people think of when they usually think of bees. So highly used social behavior, what does that mean? First of all, these are bees that live in colonies, and those colonies can be anywhere between a few hundred individuals to a few thousand, to tens of thousands of individuals, and in some cases, some species, even over 100,000 individuals living in a nest together. So we've got this colony, and within that colony, there's different castes of bee. So we've got a queen. Now, most of these only have one single egg-laying queen. Her job, just to lay eggs. She's the reproductive female, and that's all she does for her life. We've got her worker daughters. They do all of the work. Now, they don't lay eggs, but they construct the nest, they defend the nest, they gather food, they raise the babies, everything that needs to be done. And lastly, the third caste, those are the drones, the males. Now, the males don't really do very much. They do one job, and that's to leave the colony of their birth, fly around and try and find a virgin queen of another colony and try and mate with her. And barely any will ever get to do that. So most of them don't really do much at all. So the castes are characterizing in this highly used social behavior. We've also got the cooperative brood care. So everyone in that colony is working for the reproductive outcomes of that colony. They're one super organism, some people like to say. And lastly, these colonies are perennial. These colonies go on and on and on and on. Obviously, bees, individual bees, they die of old age. Sometimes after a few weeks, sometimes after a few months, occasionally after a few years. but because there's a constant upbringing of the next generation, as a reproductive unit, they're perennial and ongoing, and they can go on and on and on as long as conditions are favourable and the nest site is safe. Now, highly used social bees, we've got two groups. We've got the Apini, the honeybees, the big one here in the picture, the charismatic ones, European honeybee, most famous bee species in the world. And then we've also got the Meliponini, the stingless honeybees, the ones that I'm going to mostly talk about today. Now, in fact, they are stingless, but all female bees on the planet have stings. And if you take a female stingless bee and you sacrificed her and dissected her in the abdomen, you would find a tiny little non-functional sting. So stingless bees have evolved from stinging bees. The ancestral bee was a stinging bee, but they've lost the ability to sting over evolutionary time. Now, let's compare and contrast these two groups. They're nests to begin with. Here is a very normal picture of bees. This is Apis mellifera again, and you can see hexagons and you can see stripes. So typical of bees, people think. Now, this is a wax comb. These bees construct this comb. The worker daughters in the nest, of which there are tens of thousands, secrete wax on their abdomens from wax glands like we have in our ears. They gather that wax and they use it to construct this nest. They construct all of this honeycomb with these hexagons. And these cells, each of those hexagonal cells that you can see, they're used for one of three things. They're used either for raising brood, so a baby bee goes in there, well, an egg to begin with, and it grows inside, a brood cell, or for storing honey. The bees make honey and they put it in there and they close it, or for storing pollen. Now, it's very pale because it's made of that wax, but they're storing those three things and they're raising their babies. And in that picture at the bottom there, you can see the queen nicely in the middle, sitting on top of some brood comb. Stingless bees, they're doing the same thing, but it's all very different. Here's the stingless bee nest. Now this one's actually in a box, so forget the outside there, that's a bit unnatural, but everything inside is doing what they normally do. You can see clearly distinctly different structures. In the middle there, all of those little balls, those are also brood cells. So inside each one of those, there's a developing offspring, one single baby bee inside each. And in this species that we're looking at, each of those cells is about the size of a small rice bubble. But they don't put honey or pollen in some of those cells. They have completely separate structures. And if you look around the sides of this area, you can see those much bigger balls in big clusters. They look like big brown grapes. Those are their food storage pots. Now, these pots can contain either pollen or honey, pollen and honey pots, because pollen and honey are the two things that these bees eat. You can also see support pillars all around the place there. Now, notice how different the colour is in this case compared to the European honeybee nest that I just showed you before. This is much darker. The reason for that is because this is not exclusively made of beeswax, as it is in the honeybees. This is propolis. The young worker bees do excrete wax. They do collect it. They do use it in nest construction, but they also have forager bees going out to plants, gathering tree resins, so plant saps and things, bringing it back. They combine the resin and the wax. That's called propolis. Everything you see gets built out of propolis. Now, let's have a closer look at those honey pots. Here's some honey pots. Right in the middle there, we've got a honey pot under construction still. This is, again, the size of a small grape. There's a bee in there building it as she goes. So it's one little drop of propolis. They stick together at a time. But with so many bees, the work is not so slow. Once that's complete, about the size it is there, they put honey into it, or they put pollen into it if it's a pollen pot. And when it's full, they cap it. And you can see capped cells there around the place, those that look like they've got a little nipple on top. So that's the food storage area. Let's go back to the brood. Here are some brood cells, and you can see some worker bees working on that brood area. They're probably constructing brood cells, or maybe they're filling them with food. You can see a few there on the top half. They're open. They look like little cups. They haven't been closed. All the others are closed. Those open ones, there's worker bees who have been constructing those, a little bit of propolis at a time. Then some other worker bees come over and spit food into them, so spit nectar or put pollen in there. When it's full of food, the queen will come along, inspect it, and lay an egg inside. And once she lays an egg inside, a worker bee will then close it really quickly, just like all of those other ones there that you see, and it stays closed for the development of that bee. So the egg hatches into a larvae. The larvae consumes that pollen and honey that's in there with it. It finishes eating. The larvae then pupates, its body transforms, and it eventually crawls out as an adult bee. You don't see baby bees flying around outside because baby bees are little larvae. You'd call them maggots if they were flies, or pupae inside. So that queen, here she is. This is an Australian Tetragonula queen. And look how swollen her abdomen is. Remember, she has a single job inside the nest of a highly used social colony, and that's to lay eggs. And in this species, she'll lay hundreds of eggs every single day of her life. And her life can be for up to 4 years, we think. So she's confined to the nest. Once she's swollen with eggs like that, she can't fly. And she just goes around laying eggs with all the others doing stuff for her. Now, she can live for 4 years, but she could die at any time. And eventually she will die. And the queen is the only reproductive female. The worker bees need a queen. If the queen's gone, they can't live. They can't lay eggs. They'll eventually just trickle out. There'll be no workers left. They'll all die of old age and the colony will die out. So they need to ensure that they've got replacement queens should something happen to the queen. So they raise all these brood cells. You can see all these normal sized brood cells here. They either have worker bees in them or maybe the drones. Most of them will be workers, but right in the middle there, you can see that much bigger cell. That bigger cell is a virgin queen cell. So inside is a female bee developing. She's given more food in that cell with her compared to the worker females. And because of that more food, as she's a larvae, she grows much bigger. Her ovaries grow fully, they don't degenerate. And she emerges after growing and pupating to look like this, a virgin queen. She's a bit bigger than the workers. She's got a longer abdomen. She's got different morphology. Her antennae, her legs are a bit different. Now, she comes out of her brood cell, and for most of these virgin queens, and as a bit of a guess at an average rate of these queen production, there might be one produced each week on average. Now, she comes out and the clock starts ticking because the queen doesn't like her. Now, the queen can live for 4 years, yet these virgin queens are being produced all the time as a possible backup. They tend to live for a few weeks. They tend to be tolerated by the worker bees because they need some floating around. But at a certain point that we don't fully understand, maybe a certain point of their maturity, their age, something happens and the workers turn on them. If the queen is still in good condition and the workers decide she's fine and she can keep going a bit longer, they'll turn on the virgin queen, they'll surround her, they'll grab her from all sides, and then they'll do one of two things. One thing is to just pull from all sides and slowly dismember her, which isn't very nice. Another thing is to hold her and then bring sticky resin and pile sticky resin on her until she's immobilized, and then she just dies in the place. And if you're a lucky beekeeper, well, an interested beekeeper, you'll occasionally find these little mummified princesses around the nest, which is kind of cool. So there's a lot of drama going on inside these hives, but of course, the queen will die eventually. So after the execution of many, many princesses over a few years, the queen, getting old, maybe she dies naturally, or maybe the workers turn on her because her egg production goes down. They surround her, they dismember her or resin her up, sacrifice her, and then accept one of these virgin queens to become the new queen. There's all sorts of cool stuff with the reproductive biology that we don't fully understand for so many different stingless bee species around the world, but it's very cool. Let's move on to diversity. And we'll start with the Apini, the honeybees. They're not very diverse. Globally, there's only about 10 species. And naturally, they're confined to that coloured area you can see on the left there. The grey shaded area in the rest of the world is where humans have taken Apis mellifera, European honeybees, one of the most successful insects on the planet. Now, on the other hand, stingless bees, the other highly used social group, are very diverse. There's about 600 species globally, that's an estimate. New species are being discovered each year. They're found all around the world, but only in the tropics and the subtropics. You can see that their greatest diversity is there in South and Central America, in the Amazon. There's a place in the Amazon, the back of the Amazon, where researchers have found over 100 different stingless bee species in a single hectare of forest. In Central Africa, there's pretty good diversity too, Southeast Asia as well. And there we are, Australia, at the lowest end of the scale of diversity within the range of stingless bees, but we've got some pretty good ones as well. Now, here's just a few very nice looking ones, range from The biggest genus, so that biggest bee you can see there in the circle on the outside is a Meliponini bee. These are from Central and South America. And below it, the smallest one you can see, which is about 3 millimeters long, and that's not the smallest, by the way, also from South and Central America. In the middle, that's just Apis mellifera to give you an idea of European honeybee to compare size. But look at these diversity of shapes as well as diversity of size. And remember, there's 600 species. This is just absolutely the tip of the iceberg. And I have to say, once you've met some of these bees from overseas, the Australian ones kind of seem a bit boring. But let's talk about them anyway. We've got two groups of stingless bees here in Australia. We've got the Tetragonula stingless bees and the Ostroplebeia stingless bees. And combined, they represent 11 described species. So species that have been given names formally described by science. Tetragonula on the left here, you can see that their range is quite coastal. They're a coastal group. They're almost found down into Victoria, but not quite. A bit north of the Victorian border with New South Wales, but across the top with 6 species. Ostroplebeia, not as much coastal. They're not as found as far south as Tetragonula, but they are found much further inland. Now, a few differences here. You can see the thorax, the middle section of the Tetragonula bee there. The back of it's a bit pointy, whereas in the Ostroplebeia, it's a bit more rounded. And the Ostroplebeia bees generally look a bit more round, a little bit more furry, a little bit more cute. And Ostroplebeia often have these pale markings on their bodies, which you can see on the top of the thorax there. Something else that, well, the best way to tell the difference between these is actually to look inside the nests. And this is the brood. So the place each of those balls, remember, has a baby bee developing inside it. Tetragonula there, they always build the brood cells in the main species upwards, always facing upwards. The egg goes in the top and you get these lovely layers in some species like this one here. On the other side though, we've got Ostroplebeia and they make brood cells the same, but they're not always pointing up. In fact, the brood cells can point in any direction, up, sideways, down, and the queen lays an egg and they close them. So you get this sphere of cells pointing in all directions. So once you see this nest architecture inside, it's very easy to pick these two different groups, but superficially flying around or something, it can be a lot more tricky. They all tend to be around between 3 and 4.5 millimeters. Now, here in Australia, these two groups of bees are cavity nesting bees. They always construct their nests inside a cavity, and for most of them, that's almost always in the wild, inside a hollow tree. So think of a big old dead hollow tree or a living hollow tree or a tree branch. They find that cavity, they construct a nest inside. Now that's great, that's lovely, but it's also a vulnerability because of what us humans do. So when we clear land, we often end up clearing lots of big older trees with tree hollows. And when we leave smaller fragments behind, and this is particularly so in the tropics, smaller fragments behind, they often, the bigger older trees, if they are still there after the clearing, they often don't persist as long. Now that can have implications for organisms that nest inside those cavities. And some work that I did up in far north Queensland a few years ago was looking at Tetragonula carbonaria, one of our charismatic stingless bee species, and how frequently they're encountered in different fragment sizes. So small rainforest patches versus big. And what I found is that you find far fewer of them in these smaller rainforest fragments. And that's possibly associated with that lack of nesting resources. This has been found elsewhere too, South America, where they've got those really big charismatic Meliponini bees, as big as European honeybees. And numerous studies have shown as well that these ones, some of these Meliponini species and some other cavity nesting stingless bee species, you don't see them in deforested lands or areas with smaller habitat fragments left. So they're vulnerable to human-induced landscape change. Not all stingless bees are that vulnerable though. And in fact, some can even benefit from human-induced landscape change. Again, in South and Central America, some of the Trigona bees, not all of them, just a few, they don't nest inside cavities in trees or wherever. They construct their own cavities. And you can see on the left there, me pointing at that big nest that's made of mud and some small rocks that the bees gather as well. And if it's really dry and there's not much mud around, they'll actually collect feces to help construct that nest. Probably don't want to eat their honey. And then this other species, other Trigonus species there, on the other side, you see that nest right up the top of the tree. So these bees don't need big old trees. And some research has shown that in some places, they can become more abundant in places that have been deforested because they can still nest there and some of the competitors have been lost. So depending on the species, their responses to landscape change are diverse. Now, something else that gives some of these Trigona bees an advantage, and I will give you a warning because there's a little bit, there's a dead animal coming up on the next slide. So if you think that that's going to be a problem, look away right now. These bees can also gather meat. So bees get their protein from pollen. Pollen has protein and fats. These bees, just a few species of the Trigona bees, have evolved the ability to go and gather meat from dead animals as well. Now, some of them exclusively gather meat. They have stopped gathering pollen, but others, like these ones, will gather pollen sometimes and gather meat sometimes, like this, the ear of this poor dead calf in a rainforest patch. So that gives them another advantage in these deforested landscapes. If there's no flowers around and they can't get pollen, well, they might still be able to get meat. Okay, let's move on to something a bit more happy feeling, meliponiculture. This is the keeping of stingless bees. So you've probably heard of apiculture. Apiculture, the apis bees, the Apini bees, that's where apiculture comes from. Meliponiculture, the Meliponini bees. So keeping of stingless bees, these are both from Australia, and you can see that very hip looking hive on the left there. Stingless beekeeping is becoming a really popular thing. And mostly that's just because people want them as pets in their backyards, because it is addictive. They're fantastic to keep. In that box that you can see there, when it gets full, it might have 10,000 bees inside. They'll be coming and going from their entrance, doing their thing. Lots of people propagate them. Some people collect honey. We'll talk about that later. Mostly it's just for pets. And as a very conservative estimate, we think there's probably about 50,000 colonies of stingless bees in boxes like these on the east coast of Australia. It could be much higher than that. It's probably not much lower than that. It's a very hard thing to estimate, but 50,000 is probably close. They are used in addition to pets and in schools for education and stuff on farms, and that's a macadamia farm there on the right. You can see a row of stingless bee hives there. They're not just used in macadamia, they're used in a number of crops in Australia, mostly just this one species, one of the Tetragonula species. Here, any of these crops that have a green face next to it, they're the ones that we have data. People have gone out and looked at this and said, yes, these bees are effective pollinators of these crops. So macadamia, blueberry, strawberry, and raspberry. The others there, we think they're probably good. There are growers of these crops out there who use stingless bees in pollination and think they get a good result. It's probable that they do, but we don't have good data to show it yet. But people are working on this, so keep watching this space. Now, stingless beekeeping doesn't just happen here in Australia. It happens overseas as well. Malaysia has a fairly big stingless beekeeping industry. A bit different, you'll see here, most of these are in logs, natural logs, rather than in human-made boxes, and those structures on top are honey harvesting structures. So different to the industry we have here, which is mostly driven by boxed colonies being propagated to make more boxed colonies. Indonesia as well. And this is cool. These are in bamboo sections. These are being used for crop pollination. Here's a nice colony opened. You can see on the right there, lots of brood cells. On the left, honey. India in a box. So India for crop pollination, for small scale honey production, for pets as well, I'm sure. But probably the most developed stingless bee industry in the world, certainly the biggest, is in Brazil. And Brazil has 330 plus stingless bee species, quite a few of which can be kept in boxes, various size boxes. People keep them as hobbies, pets, pollination, honey production. It's all more developed there. Okay, time to talk about honey. Honey, just think of 600 stingless bee species around the world, at least 600 different types of honey. And if you think of all the different forms of honey they can have because of all the different flowers they visit, it's like 600 times infinity. Who knows? Imagine all those different flavors of honey. Now, we know a fair bit about stingless bee honey here in Australia because a number of different labs have researched this. We know that it differs from European honeybee honey. It's not as sugary. It doesn't have as much sugar. It's not as thick. It's a bit more runny because the sugar-water ratio is a bit higher on the water side. What we also know about it is that it's got high antimicrobial properties. So all honey to some extent is antimicrobial. Some honeys, like Manuka honey, have these extra good antimicrobial qualities. Stingless bee honey from this species here, Tetragonula carbonaria, has been looked at in labs, and it has antimicrobial qualities as good as Manuka honey, which is very exciting. This is an infant industry. There's not much honey around. Not many people are studying this, but think of the future and the potential for this industry with these sorts of uses for the honey. Now, why is this honey good? Well, let's talk about European bee honey first. Honey is nectar gathered by bees at flowers. They bring it back, and nectar is sugar water. It's quite watery. They bring it back, and through a process of regurgitation and swallowing, they evaporate off some of the water, a lot of the water. They concentrate it into a thick, sugary substance, honey. They regurgitate it into a honey storage spot, so in this case, into one of these hexagonal cells, and then they close it. Now, those wax cells, wax has no flavor, wax has no smell. So when you taste a honeybee honey, you're tasting the flavors, the concentrated flavors of the nectars of whatever plant species those bees have been visiting. But let's look at stingless bee pots again, honey pots, and they put their honey inside there, they close it. And those pots are made not just of wax, but of tree resins as well. Those tree resins infuse flavors, they infuse smells, and they infuse chemicals. And so when you eat a stingless bee honey, it is more watery, but it's more tart, it's more sharp, citrusy. It sometimes has a bit of a bite to it as it goes down your throat. So you've got all these different feelings as you eat it. And they largely come about as a result of the resins infusing flavor. So it's two flavors, nectars and resins. And of course, the resins infusing chemicals probably is where a lot of the antimicrobial qualities of these honeys come from. Now, think of these honeys. Here in Australia, for tens of thousands of years, Indigenous people have been eating these in the subtropics and the tropical parts of Australia. And yet today, even with this growing industry of stingless bees, it's not something that you can go out to shops and buy. The industry of stingless beekeeping is small, and the honey production is even smaller. But this is something that's on the industry's radar, the production of honey, the sale of honey, this new healthy antimicrobial product. And right on our doorstep, here in Brisbane, and this is over at Minjerribah, North Stradbroke Island, we've got Quandamooka traditional owners establishing, this started a couple of years ago, this big plan of production of native stingless bee honey right here for sale to fancy restaurants where they've got this exclusive relationship with one chain of restaurants. But this is the beginning. I expect a lot more of this stuff to happen, a lot more small-scale stingless bee honey production. But something that's standing in the way of honey production and the sale of honey in Australia is the fact that stingless bee honey doesn't have a formal food standard here in Australia. So most foods have a standard. This is a document that describes the parameters of that food product. What's an acceptable amount of this, this, and this in that. European honeybee honey, it has a food standard. So when you sell European honeybee honey, it has to fit within the parameters of that standard to be saleable product. Stingless bees, we don't have that. So selling stingless bee honey, it becomes a little bit murky. And one thing that's standing in the way of this industry developing further is the creation of that honey standard. But to have a honey standard, you need to know more about your honey. You need to have a really good understanding of the honey. And bring in the University of Queensland, we have a research group here at QAFI, led by Mary Fletcher here in the picture, who work on honey chemistry and honey composition. And Mary and her team are starting a new project at the moment where one of the aims is to find the sorts of parameters that will be useful to describing stingless bee honey standard, and also finding ways to tell what is a true stingless bee honey and what's not, because I'm sure you've all heard of fake honey and everything. So once you've got a standard and once you start enforcing a standard or checking it, you need to have methods to know if it really is that. And that's one of the things that Mary and her team are doing now. Now let's step over to where I am at the School of Biological Sciences at the St. Lucia campus. And if you're walking around campus anytime, go over to the Goddard building and go and look at some of the display stingless bee hives that we've got outside there. And if you're there on a nice sunny day in spring or summer or maybe autumn and you get really lucky, you might see some carnage unfolding. You might see a fighting swarm. So fighting swarms, any stingless beekeepers who are watching will know a little bit about this. Fighting swarms are this big dramatic thing of death outside a stingless beehive. Everything you can see on the ground there in front of that hive are dead bees or dying bees. And on the right, you can see lots of dead bees. Now, this is a bit traumatic if you've not seen this before, thousands of dead bees. This is a natural process. And if you look closely at those bees on the ground, you'll actually find there are lots of pairs of bees. Each, it's a couple, a dying or dead couple. Now, what's happened here is one colony somewhere nearby that's strong has seen this colony as a target. They've sent thousands of workers over to try and get inside. When they try and get inside, the colony under attack realizes they're under attack. It sends out thousands of workers, and in the air, they swarm around, and the attackers and the defenders grab each other in the air. They fall to the ground, and they wrestle and kill each other. Everyone who hits the ground dies. Now, what's the point of this? Well, the point is the colony that has the most workers to sacrifice wins. And if that's the attacking colony, the last of the attackers go on inside. They find the queen, they kill her, they drag her body outside and dump it. More move in. They enslave the baby bees that are in there. They inherit all of the honey and pollen and propolis that's in there. In the space of just a few days, they can take over this complete nest full of all of these resources and these baby slaves. It's dramatic. How do the bees choose these sorts of things? Who knows? But this is something that we're interested in at the University of Queensland and something that we've been working on. And something that we did fairly recently, led by a student, Yolanda Lau, found that in these cases, it's not always one against one. In one that she studied, there were 5 colonies attacking this one poor colony over 5 months, repeated attacks. The queen kept changing as different teams won briefly before being taken over again. It's all very cool. Okay, I need to move on, so I'm gonna rush through a few things. I just want to describe some of the other things that we do, and you might think this is a little bit nasty, but this bee survives that's here. We paint bees. Now, we're also interested in what's going on in the hive. What are these bees doing in terms of their sociality and their communication and everything? And to get a handle on that, you have to know who individual bees are. So some of the projects that we are interested in, we mark bees like this with paint. This is a young bee, it's a callow, it's a new adult, less than a day old, and then we release them inside the nest and we can watch them, and we can watch what happens through time, and we can mark multiple cohorts and see how those cohorts interact as well. And there's lots of things around this that we have plans for in the near future. But depends on your hive if you can see in or not. And obviously you need hives that you can see in. So we started out doing this with regular hives. It's a bit hard to see in. We've now got these flat hives. The inside depth there is only 4 centimeters, and there's a window through the top. There's a lid there, and we can see inside, and we can see a lot more. We can see the brood. You can see in the middle there, towards the edges there, all the honey and pollen pots, and at one end, which you can't quite see, the entrance tube. All these places, they don't easily hide from us when we look through these, but we do have to change the windows fairly often. At the St. Lucia campus, we keep some of our bees in this facility. It's actually on a roof, so we're pretty hip rooftop beekeepers. And it looks a bit like a prison, I'll admit that, but it's a pretty good facility. It doesn't get too hot in summer, which is a big problem for stingless bees in boxes. But it isn't a great big area. And you can see there, we've got 5 hives in that little space when we took that photo. And you can see all those crazy colored shapes out the front of it. Those colored shapes we use to train those bees to know which one is their nest. Because if these bees in this close proximity, when we move them around, accidentally go to the wrong hive, they go in, that colony will think it's under attack. They'll come out and start fighting. And we, the beekeepers, cause this great big misunderstanding and all these bees to swarm around and die, which we don't want. So keeping them in high densities like this, we have to use these artificial landmarks and things to help them navigate their way. So I'm going to finish by talking about my main partner in crime with stingless bees at the University of Queensland, Dr. James Hereward. James Hereward is a geneticist. Here he is in his lab, mashing up some bee bodies. And James is interested in all sorts of components of their ecology, the biology and the evolution of these bees and their relatedness, their evolutionary relatedness between different species. So what we do is we gather sacrificial stingless bees from colonies. It's not nice for them, but there were 10,000 bees in these colonies probably. So it's just a few donating their bodies to science. This is in ethanol, which preserves their DNA. We go around and we gather these where we can from different colonies of different species. Beekeepers also sometimes send us these. And James extracts their DNA and he's able to look at them, their genetic differences among species. And he's got a couple of projects on the go at the moment, which I don't have time to go into, looking at possible hybridization and things like that. You can read about that if you're interested in it, but also looking at the number of species and the relatedness among species. And my final take-home message of this is a phylogenetic tree. It just shows different species. The closer together they are on the tree, the more closely related. And it tells us something about the time since they evolved from one another, because all these bees came from a common ancestor once upon a time. But the really cool thing about this picture is, remember I told you that there were 6 Tetragonula stingless bee species described in Australia, yet here there are 7. Tetragonula melipes 2, the one that I've got, the bigger bee over on the left there, that's an undescribed species that James discovered by doing DNA work from bees from the Northern Territory. So this is a cryptic species. We call it cryptic because it looks just like the others, but it doesn't. It's a little bit different, but it's hard to tell the difference. Now, I want to finish with a question to you. This work's all ongoing. You can ask me about it later, but think of the other cryptic stingless species around Australia and probably around the world that we don't know about yet, that we will find out about in the future. So with that, I'm done. Actually, I'm not. I've got one more slide to show you, just to tell you that we do native bee identification workshops at the University of Queensland to members of the public. We've got a website, so come and check it out. It's not just related to stingless bees, it's all bees. I don't just work on stingless bees. But yes, thank you very much for listening. Haven't done too badly with time, Joel. Where's Joel? There he is.
No, you have done brilliant with time. Thank you, Tobias. That is a fantastic talk. And reflecting that is the huge volume of questions that are coming in. So if you've got a question, pop it into the Q&A. Meanwhile, BrisScience will indeed be back next month. And we're going to be hearing from Yoni Nazarathi, who is actually from the School of Mathematics and Physics at the University of Queensland, talking about not quantum physics, but in fact the digital aspects of the COVID-19 spread, tracking that spread and how we do that. So a very topical question as we start to emerge out of lockdown. So make sure you head to the BrisScience website, sign up to the mailing list, head to our Facebook page, and we'll post all the details of that very shortly. Tobias, I might get you to stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
And then we can both appear in large size there. Fantastic. Okay, so we have lots of questions coming through. I'm going to start with, so I'm just flicking through here. Let's start with some of the important ones. What can we do to help with reducing habitat fragmentation?
Look, habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, habitat degradation, these aren't just threats to stingless bees. These are some of the biggest threats to biodiversity across the planet. So if I had an easy answer to that, we'd all be fine and all our species would be fine. But I think well, ideally, we don't deforest or dehabitat landscapes. Look, that's really my answer. It's a really complicated one, and this is something that society has to decide if we value these places of habitat. But what is certain is that if we do preserve habitat, preserving it in the biggest chunks possible with connectivity between chunks seems to be something that doesn't just help bees, but it helps all sorts of species. So look, my answer to that is we try to protect the habitat that's there, number one, and we try and replace it. But look at an old tree, you know, it's going to take 80 to 100 years to replace a tree with hollows. So protect the ones that we've already got. Yeah.
Thanks, Tobias. We have several questions about honey. So perhaps you could talk about how you extract honey from a stingless hive. Louisa notes this is obviously not spinning like the European extraction.
Well, it actually depends. It's typically not, no, but there are a few people who tinker around and come up with new inventions for doing things, one of which is somebody in Brisbane who has created a spinning way of getting honey out. But no, most people don't spin it out. In fact, it's very simple and low tech. Most people pierce the honey pots. So I didn't show you the design of a hive, but most hives for stingless bees in Australia and in places like Brazil are designed in such a way that you can separate the brood area, the babies, from the main honey storage area. And that's usually a separate part to the box. You can take that off and use just some sort of tool to pierce those honey pots. They're like little bags of sweetness, and then use gravity to drain it out. That's a typical way. Look, different people have different methods. Different regions around the world have different methods, but it's fairly simple. It's a timely process. It's not as streamlined as European honey production, which is something else that will have to happen for this industry to develop. And also you get much smaller quantities of honey. Like if you're lucky, you'll get a kilo a year from a colony. Whereas if you're lucky and you're a honeybee keeper, you're talking about 8 kilos a year, 80 kilos a year, sorry. So it's different, but it's worth it.
And so just following up on that, Akanksha and Dawn are asking questions about honey standards. And I forget who it was, but somebody has asked about, you mentioned fake honey. So could you perhaps just talk a little bit about, fake honey and honey standards and what we're talking about there?
Okay, first of all, I will qualify this that I am not a fake honey expert. I don't really do this, but look, fake honey, it's something that happens with European honeybee. That's where we hear about it. And I think this is because this is the global food system. I mean, it's a commercial product. And so people see ways to profit in unethical ways around it. And that's usually faking honey, making sugar sweetness stuff that tastes like honey, or feeding bees sugar water and them converting that sugar water into honey and then selling that as honey, which it's been through a bee, but it's not from plants and nectar. So that's what we generally talk about with fake honeys. Now, look, with stingless bees, I have never heard any stories of fake stingless bee honey, and it's mostly fairly easy to taste the difference. But we're talking about seeing a day in the future when you'll see stingless bee honey in the shops. You'll see all sorts of businesses of various sizes selling it. And so at that point, having a test that one tells you if it probably is stingless bee honey, and secondly, as we get to understand more of its composition, what are the qualities about different honeys that make them more desirable to us or more antimicrobial? And if there's a test that can tell us that sort of stuff, then it's going to have a lot of different applications into the future. And look, it's not just Australian stingless bee honey. That's what we're focused on. That's what Mary's team's focused on. But think of all those other regions as well with these developing industries.
Yeah, great. All right, I'm going to ask you 3 more questions. We're a tiny bit over time, so if you have to leave, that's okay. You can't catch this video online, but there are so many here I want to get through. One question is, has the introduction of European bees had an impact on Australian native bees?
Excellent question. A hard one to do justice to very quickly, but what I will say is yes. Yes, but it's poorly studied. So European honeybees, they've been here for 200 years-ish. They've done very well. In fact, Australia has some of the most healthy populations of European honeybees in the world because we don't have some of the key problems that they have elsewhere. But yes, a colony of European honeybees typically has something like 40,000 bees in them. They're big, they're hairy, they can fly at low temperatures, big workforce, big bee, they can suck up more nectar, gather more pollen. So yes, they can be a detriment to native organisms, including native bees. They can do things like bullying them from flowers, getting to floral resources before them, all sorts of things. But it hasn't been well studied because it's really difficult to study. And it's also landscape specific. One landscape might have so many floral resources that there's enough for everyone. And we've got to remember, we're not just comparing native bees with European honeybees. We're comparing native flower visiting insects because bees aren't the only things that eat pollen and nectar. So are there enough resources for everyone? In some landscapes, there absolutely aren't. And although we don't know it with quantitatively, we haven't got data, it's very probable that competition happens in some landscapes. So yes, but I can't give you really solid answers because it's poorly studied.
No, totally fair. Other big question, of course, is what can the community do to get into stingless bees? Obviously, there's a range. People note there's a range of costs and different types of hives out there, and so forth. What's your tips? And that could be, for example, coming to one of your workshops.
Yeah, come to a workshop. The first thing I'd say about bees and getting into bees is we can all get into bees by protecting habitat and by making more habitat. If we keep bees wild and functioning and thriving in the wild, we're doing our bit to conserve bees. Keeping bees isn't conserving bees, but keeping bees is fantastic fun, and you're not really harming the environment by doing it, and you're engaging with nature, and that's probably benefiting the environment. So what can you do? It's very simple these days. There are a lot of commercial sellers of stingless beehives if you live kind of Sydney-ish, a bit south of Sydney, north. Unfortunately, it's mainly around the population centres. So if you get into North Queensland, there's fewer people that sell them there. The Northern Territory, the same. But yes, there's a range of commercial sellers that you can look up. And I'd encourage you to look up the Australian Native Bee Association, which has just been around for a year, but it is there to represent stingless beekeepers and enthusiasts of all sorts of native bees, or the majority that I ignored today, the non-stingless ones. So it's not hard. There are a few key things, you put one in your garden, as long as you don't kill it in the summer sun and take some very simple steps, they can sit there and you do nothing and they'll thrive by themselves. So yes, look it up. There are some great books as well.
Great. And then the big question for you is, what's next? If you had, if we all chipped in and, you got you a huge budget, what would you do next? What's your big wish list?
Oh, well, the 20 projects that we've got written down that we haven't done yet, that's probably what we do, get people to help us do them. No, look, I think this stuff that James Herrowood does, going exploring for new species, is very exciting. I mean, this gets us excited. So being able to do more samples, really, if we could do samples from all over the place, because those samples, it costs money to extract DNA, and James and people to help him do it. So we've got that. Something that I do as well, which isn't just focused on stingless bees, is developing resources to help non-scientists engage better with bees. So I create resources for identifying bees and things like that. There's so much potential for helping the general population catch up with scientists who are racing ahead to find new species and everything, and leaving everyone behind without conveying that to them. So I think expanding the programs that we've already got, keeping more stingless bees at the University of Queensland is always something that I would be happy. I think if I got given millions of dollars, the uni would probably give me more space to keep more bees, and we'd be able to have more students and find out more things. Yeah.
And now I'm going to sneak in one more bonus question, because Charlotte, age 9, is asking the big questions, and she wants to know, how do you paint a bee?
Charlotte, it takes a lot of practice, and it takes the right paint pen. Actually, that paint pen in the picture is not the sort of paint pen we use anymore, because it's a little bit too broad, but that picture's from a few years ago when we were just getting used to it. So you have to get them on the thorax. Now, you can use a very fine pen, and these are paint pens, so it obviously doesn't come off again. And it's very careful not to paint them on the wings. If you paint them on the wings, they can't fly and they're not going to live a very good life. Bees, most people don't realize, have 2 sets of eyes. Well, all insects. Big compound eyes on the sides of their heads and 3 little simple eyes on top. If you paint those, or the antennae as well, that bee is going to have a terrible life. So you have to get it right in the sweet spot, the middle of its shoulders. We don't call them shoulders. And then let it dry while you're holding it before you let it go. So it takes a lot of practice, Charlotte. And I admit that I'm sure the bees don't like being painted, but we find out some pretty good stuff, which hopefully part of which will help us to understand these better and conserve them better in the wild.
That's fantastic. Tobias, thank you so much. There are at least 40 more questions sitting in my inbox here. So it looks like we could talk about bees all day, and maybe we need to get you back again in the future. Obviously, in the meantime, you are on social media and, of course, the UQ's website. So I'm sure if people have burning questions, they can tweet you various things. Yep. Thank you so much for everybody coming out tonight. It's great to see such support for the online BrisScience format, and we will definitely be back next month, so don't forget to sign up to that. But please join me again thanking, virtual round of applause, Tobias, for a fantastic presentation. I can see all the thank yous coming in here, so that is fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the great questions.